Greetings. Welcome, friends, to the 2014 Focus Series. I want to start with a very important thank you to Robbie Bolton, our library director, and the director of Focus for all of the tireless work he has put into making this week a wonderful week of presentations. As many of you know, we've worked very hard this year to make Focus an entire week of events, hoping to extend and sharpen our interactions with this year's theme. Today, we are blessed to have an entire day dedicated to that theme, and you have no classes, so you need to come to the events. Yes, exciting. Why are we in college? Classes. So please be sure to note that we have other workshops scheduled. You may have seen these on the slides. And there will be another set of workshops at 1:15. We will also have a time of refreshment with Dr. Ostrander, our speaker today, at 2:30 in the polling lounge, and all are welcome. And there are refreshments, so you should want to be there also. Dr. Rick Ostrander is Provost and Chief Academic Officer at Cornerstone University in Grand Rapids, Michigan. He holds a doctorate and master's degree in American history from the University of Notre Dame, a bachelor's degree in history from the University of Michigan, and a bachelor's degree in theology from Moody Bible Institute. As a scholar of American religion and an academic administrator, Dr. Ostrander maintains an active interest in Christian higher education. His publications include The Life of Prayer in a World of Science, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2001, and Why College Matters to God, Academic Faithfulness and Christian Higher Education, which served as a primary text this fall for many of you in Core 100. Most recently, Dr. Ostrander published Reconsidering College, Christian Higher Education for Working Adults with Abilene Christian University Press, a work that offers a Christian worldview on adult education and the purpose and value of work. In Why College Matters to God, Dr. Ostrander notes that, quote, just as carpenters need training in order to remodel the house, so Christians need education in the complex cultural tasks of modern society if they are to be effective restorers of God's creation, unquote. An appropriate idea, given that work is our focus theme. It would follow then that if we hope to be effective restorers of God's creation, we might do well to begin with the transformation of our hearts and minds, with the reformation and restoration of our affections. And so I ask you all a first question. Will you endeavor to embrace the hard work of reformation? As President Ellis noted in his inaugural address, Spring Arbor University must be a community of learners marked by our pursuit of wisdom in all that we do. And so I ask you all a second question. Will you submit yourselves to the arduous pursuit of wisdom in humility and gratitude, with hope, through love? With such love and gratitude, will you please join me in welcoming our distinguished guest, Dr. Rick Ostrander, as he speaks to us today about redeeming work.
Hear me okay? There we are. Okay. Yes, I'm the guy who wrote that book that many of you read last fall. My son Ryan is actually working at a semester abroad program in Quito, Ecuador right now, and has a number of college students at the program, including some from John Brown University, which is another school that uses my book. So he heard a couple of students talking one day. They didn't know who Ryan was, my son, and one of them said, did you have to read that book, Why College Matters to God? And the other one said, yeah. I said, yeah, it's kind of boring. I didn't really like it. And my son Ryan just started laughing, and I then informed them who he was. But hopefully you do enjoy and benefit from parts of that book. It was really written as a result of my interaction with college students at John Brown University, as I mentioned there in the introduction. Well, let me give you greetings from Cornerstone University, just down the road. Anyone from Grand Rapids here? All right? Go Grand Rapidians, I guess we call them, where we have just surpassed about 100 inches of snow this year. That's probably a little more than you have here in Spring Arbor, but I do notice you still have plenty on the ground as well. Our spring break is next week. I'm not sure when yours is, but I'm going to be on my way to Florida, or actually in Florida right now next week, so I'm looking forward to getting out of here for a few days. So hopefully you will be as well. I really appreciate the invitation from Dr. Baker to be here today. I really like this idea of not just of canceling classes, but of focusing on a particular topic or theme for the week and especially for a day. To me, it's really what liberal arts education is all about. And so I like to steal ideas when I travel around to other schools, and this may be one that I steal and bring back to Cornerstone with me. So it is a privilege for me to be here and be able to speak as part of this series. I'm reminded of Mark Twain's definition of an expert, which is that an expert is an ordinary person who happens to be from another town. And in this case, I'm about 3 towns over from you, so I realize that what qualifies me in part to be here is the fact that I'm someone from outside the campus and can give a perspective on that. I saw the program. There's been a lot of really interesting talks and topics focusing on work, and so I'm not sure how much I can add that will be new to that. Hopefully I can draw some things together and add to our insights when it comes to work. I have some PowerPoints. One of the dangers when you travel is you don't get a chance to format your slides adequately for the projectors here. So I do have some text on these. I'm not sure the entire text is going to show, so I might have to explain the slides a little more as we go. Let me open us in prayer, and then I'll get started on my talk here. Father, I thank you for this opportunity to be here today. I thank you for these students and staff and faculty who have gathered here to focus on this important topic. I pray that you would give us attentiveness, that you would give me wisdom in my words, and that we would glorify you in our time together. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, I've entitled this talk, Redeeming Work. So let me go ahead and get started. I thought I would begin this talk with a story from my own childhood to establish my credentials on the subject. My first job was as a paper boy in Chicago, and this was back when people used to read their news on paper, remember, back in those days, not on your smartphone or your computer. So I would get up at 5:30 in the morning to deliver the Chicago Tribune to houses in my suburban Chicago neighborhood. Every Thursday morning, the papers would come to my house with large, bulky advertising inserts, which I was supposed to put inside the papers before delivering them. But the inserts were heavy and cumbersome, and I figured, who really reads classified ads anyway? So on especially cold and wet Thursday mornings, I would toss the inserts under our back porch rather than putting them in the newspapers. Over the years, these inserts accumulated, as you might imagine, until when my parents sold our house, the home inspector crawled under the back porch and discovered piles of old newspaper inserts laying around. Needless to say, my parents were not very pleased with my work ethic at the time, and I'm sure some sort of punishment followed. Now, despite that poor start, I did eventually learn a few things about work, and I would like to share those things this morning. So to begin with, what do we mean by work? Let me begin with the dictionary here. The dictionary defines it in 2 ways: activity involving mental or physical effort done in order to achieve a result or a purpose. Or secondly, and this is more germane to our purposes, mental or physical activity as a means of earning income, i.e. unemployment, which is what we mean when we ask someone, what is your work? What do you do? Usually we mean, what are you doing for a living? So to begin with, I would argue that we Christians often have a somewhat confused view of work. Now, I began with my newspaper story. Let me offer a few other stories here to illustrate my point. Last month at our Sunday morning church service, a missionary from Zaire gave his testimony, and it went something like this. I attended a Christian college and majored in engineering. After graduating, I planned to work for 3M Corporation in Minnesota. But the Lord was working on my heart, and I knew that there must be more to life than a 9-to-5 job. I love working on cars and machines, so as I followed God's will for my life, I ended up serving as a mechanic at a school for missionary kids in Zaire, Africa. Now, this was an approach to work that I was familiar with growing up in evangelicalism. One in which there is, quote, Christian work, which consists of being a missionary or a pastor, and then there's ordinary secular work. Or here's how my own story turned out, and you heard some of that from the introduction. I attended the Moody Bible Institute and met my wife as a student there. We actually met during my first week of school at Moody. We got married after graduation, and my wife went straight into a master's degree in music. I took a job in a telecommunications software company in order to pay the bills. Actually, I didn't know anything about computers. This is in the late 1980s, and very few of us did know much about computers, but I took the job anyway. I didn't really like the job, especially the predictable 9 to 5, Monday through Friday nature of the work. So after my wife finished her degree, I went back to graduate school, got a PhD in history, and eventually became a history professor. Now I serve as a college provost, where the 9 to 5 routine of work that I had 20 years ago has morphed into a 7 to 6 job instead. Finally, there's the work story that many of you may be engaged in as students here at Spring Arbor, one that can be called the American dream. You diligently work to earn your bachelor's degree from a quality Christian university so that upon graduation, you can get a good job. In fact, you even have an insurance policy here to help pay your school loans if that doesn't happen. Not all colleges have that. You may not like the job you end up with, but hopefully it will pay a decent salary. With that salary, you will support your church and a few missionaries, buy a house and a car, get married, and raise a family. You will work to send your kids to college so that they in turn can get a job, buy a house, start a family, and send their kids to college. And the cycle goes on seemingly without any larger point to it. Now, perhaps our confusion about the value of work stems in part from our reading of the Bible. For example, in the Gospels, we find Jesus calling his disciples to abandon their work so that they can follow him. Jesus meets Peter by his fishing boat and tells him to leave his business and, in the words of that great old Sunday school song that we grew up singing, "Follow me and I will make you fishers of men." In Luke chapter 5, Jesus meets Matthew the tax collector, and the text says, after this he went out and saw a tax collector named Levi sitting at the tax booth. And he said to him, "Follow me." And leaving everything, Levi rose and followed him. So a simple reading of the Gospels would suggest that if we're serious about discipleship, we need to abandon everyday work in order to focus on following Jesus. But then we move on a few pages to the early church. When the Apostle Paul is instructing new believers in Thessalonica about how to live as followers of the way, he tells them to get busy at their daily work and concludes with the words, "Lead a quiet life and work with your hands." Just the sort of thing that Peter and the other disciples had quit doing in order to follow Jesus. So in talking about a Christian view of work, it would be best to begin with the biblical foundation for work, one not based on one or two passages, but on the broad narrative of Scripture. So I'm going to do that first, and then I'll apply this theology of work to our daily lives as we seek to move from the world of the Bible to the complicated world of the 21st century. Now, for those of you who have read my book, this won't come as a surprise to you that I'm going to place work within the framework of creation, fall, and redemption. So let's begin with this. Good, you can see that one. Work is good. The creation account in Genesis teaches us that work is good. The Bible opens with God actively at work in creating the universe. But God's intention in creating the universe, Genesis suggests, was not to do all the work, but rather to make a space where his creatures could enjoy the pleasure and fulfillment of work. Andy Crouch, in his new book, Playing God, Redeeming the Gift of Power, makes an insight into the words of Genesis. In the typical top-down corporation, the chief executive gives the orders, and people carry those orders out. In the term that's used, it's make it so, as in, I have developed a new marketing plan, and now you go make it so. You carry out my directions. But the language of God's creative action is not make it so, but rather let there be, as in let there be light, let there be sea creatures, let the earth bring forth. The language suggests open-endedness, abundance in unexpected ways, and agency on the part of the creatures. God doesn't micromanage his new creation. He expresses general directions and lets his new, abundant creation fill in the blanks. In other words, God creates a universe with space for his creatures to work. Ultimately, the prime workers in this space are Adam and Eve. In Genesis chapter 1, God tells humans to, quote, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, and over every living creature. And a few verses later, the text states, the Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and take care of it. Once again, that word, work. One of the astounding truths of Genesis is that God gives human beings tremendous responsibilities to work and to exercise power over creation. So in the universe the way God intended it to be, work is a good thing. It brings positive changes to the world, and it brings us satisfaction as agents of those changes. That's why one of the first things we do as children is to make things. It's as if we instinctively perceive that the world is a big can of Play-Doh, and our job is to work it into new creations. We make towers out of blocks. We turn couch cushions and blankets into forts. That was my particular favorite job as a child. We make sandcastles at the beach. It's what we call play, but it's actually work. Because in the world that God intended, play and work are difficult to separate. We still experience examples of the pleasure of work. This is obvious in the area of manual labor. My father-in-law was a builder for 30 years in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and he enjoyed the satisfaction of putting a house together or putting a new roof on our first house in Ypsilanti, Michigan, just down the road. The impulse to make something new where nothing was there before is deeply embedded into us. Even now, at 85 years old, my father-in-law spends summer evenings pruning his fruit trees or hoeing weeds in the corn patch or getting scolded by his wife for riding the lawnmower up the steep slope of their yard. He's tipped over twice in the past year. He loves to work. Imagine an 85-year-old man rolling down the hill with a lawnmower. That's why he gets scolded. Now, you probably don't plan on going into farming, but even what we call the white-collar jobs that many of us work in, we are wired to experience the goodness of work. Recently, author Daniel Pink wrote a book called Drive, which explores what motivates people to excel in their work. Now, contrary to what you might think, Pink concludes it's not money. Pink argues that what drives people to work hard are three things. First, autonomy, that is a level of independence in how they do their work. Second, challenge, that the work involves difficult tasks that require your best effort to accomplish it. And third, meaning, that the work has a sense of broader purpose to it. Now, as Christians who believe that humans are made in God's image to find fulfillment in work, we can definitely resonate with Pink's argument. As a provost, for example, I get a strong sense of satisfaction when we hire a good new professor, or when I resolve a potential crisis through a series of sensitive conversations. Much of our work in a university provides these instances of satisfaction. An essay that through many revisions presents a convincing thesis. A lab experiment that actually proves your hypothesis. A history lecture that comes off just right and that actually keeps your students' attention. All these experiences attest to the goodness of work. Now, when we consider the conclusion of the biblical narrative, it's easy to see the value of work. The book of Revelation tells us that the culmination of God's redemptive work will not be another garden, but rather a city. And not an ordinary city, but one with walls decorated with precious jewels, streets of gold, and full of gardens and vineyards. In other words, it's a city that displays the best products of human labor. So work is good not just because we enjoy it, but because our work creates things that will last for eternity. That's why Paul could instruct his followers to lead a quiet life and work with their hands. Work is good. Of course, there's more to the story. Here's the second part of this. Like everything else in this world, work is also fallen. Now, to understand that, we have to go back to the Genesis story of creation. After Adam and Eve disobey God and are cast out of the garden, God tells Adam in these words, "Cursed is the ground because of you. In pain you will eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it will bring forth for you. You will eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you will eat bread until you return to the ground." Now, the change in imagery here in Genesis 3 is dramatic. Genesis chapters 1 and 2 describe a lush, cool garden with Adam and Eve cultivating and nurturing the plants. In other words, picture a Michigan backyard in a June evening. Chapter 3 describes a hot, dusty field with Adam hacking away at hard soil and lugging gallons of waters trying to keep the plants alive. In other words, if you've ever been out there, picture a West Kansas wheat field sometime in August, something like that. Now, in one of these, the work is enjoyable and yields productive results. In the second, after the fall, the work is hard and the results are minimal. Now, as we all know, these contrasts are all too real in our own lives. Very often, work isn't very fun. That's why we get paid to do it. As I said earlier, I usually enjoy my life as provost, but sometimes I don't. I've had to tell people who have worked at my university for years that we no longer have a job for them. Or I've had to take a call from an angry parent who's complaining about how I can allow X to continue to happen on our campus. That's when I wish I was building houses like my father-in-law. Now, you face the same thing in your work as a student. One of my favorite films growing up was Dead Poets Society. I know it's a little old, but maybe some of you seen Dead Poets Society? Okay, you know what I'm talking about. That's how the classroom is supposed to be, right? Robin Williams as your English professor, cracking wonderful jokes, reading Walt Whitman in class, and inspiring you to make your lives extraordinary. But all too often, the classroom resembles another high school movie of mine, Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Okay, some of you have seen Ferris Bueller's Day Off, obviously. And of course, in that classic classroom scene, the teacher drones on about voodoo economics. Some of you can repeat that with me, while the girl in the fourth row dozes off with drool running down her cheek. Or you sit down to write what you thought would be a rather easy paper assignment, and 1 hour later, you're still sitting there staring at a blank computer screen. We all know what that feels like. Then there's the office world that awaits you. And I love the commercials about the workplace that you see on TV. Usually they show a bunch of attractive and, of course, culturally diverse 20-somethings working on a creative project together. The women are smartly dressed and the men sport stubbly beards and thick black glasses, the kind that were signs of nerdiness when I was a kid but now are so cool. They're working on Macs, iPads, and smartboards, and after having tons of fun together designing a new sports car, they go off to the local pub to drink low-calorie beer together. Now, unfortunately, in real life, the workplace often looks more like Dunder Mifflin in The Office. And yes, you've seen The Office too, obviously. You process forms for unknown purposes, petty rivalries pervade the workplace, and you may feel that your boss is as vain and socially inept as Michael. In other words, work on this side of the fall isn't always cracked up to be. And fortunately, there is more to this story, and this gets to part 3, of course. After the fall in Genesis 3, we find God at work in Christ to bring redemption and restoration to all of his creation. Christ came to earth not just to save individual persons, but to begin the process of reclaiming God's rule over all creation and restoring things to the way they were intended to be. As the hymn writer Charles Wesley put it, he comes to make his blessings known far as the curse is found. And since the curse applies to work, redemption does too. So as Christ's agents of renewal on earth, our work is one of the things we're called to redeem. Now, as I quote in my book, the writer Gabe Lyons summarizes the situation well when he describes Christians as restorers who, like a builder remodeling a beautiful but rundown mansion, are engaged in making the world what God intended it to be. This is what Gabe Lyons writes. Instead of waiting for God to unveil the new heaven and the new earth, we can give the world a taste of what God's kingdom is all about: building up, repairing brokenness, showing mercy, reinstating hope, and generally adding value. And for many of us, the primary way that we will live out our roles as restorers in society is through meaningful work that not only brings us individual fulfillment, but that meets a need in the world. So what do I mean when I say that work itself is an area of redemption? Basically, I mean 2 things. First, as Christians, we bring our values to the work itself. And then second, we can use that work to bring redemption to other parts of creation. Let me give an example for you here from the work of journalism, which may be appropriate for some of you students here. The Christian journalist will recognize the subtle ways in which this particular corner of creation, that is, journalism, is, quote, not the way it's supposed to be, in the words of theologian Neil Plantinga. Members of the media sometimes highlight the absurd or the trivial in order to gain audience share, or they violate ethical standards in order to get a scoop. Thus, the Christian journalist may at times resist the status quo by writing a complex, difficult story that deserves attention despite the lack of potential market share. or by respecting a person's privacy, even when that means losing a story. In these little ways, he or she brings a Christian influence to this particular corner of creation. Now, on a broader level, the work of journalism can bring a redemptive influence to the world. Cultures flourish when members of communities are better informed. It could be something as simple as a well-crafted story of a winning high school basketball team that galvanizes community pride, or something bigger like bringing the light of truth to areas of injustice and oppression. For example, the civil rights movement of the 1960s would never have succeeded in ending segregation without reporters and journalists broadcasting the abuse of peaceful protesters to a watching world. All of these ways illustrate the fact that Christianity brings a new sense of vitality to work, not just to earn a living, but to influence our culture in significant ways. In fact, the early Christians influenced and eventually dominated the Roman Empire, not by seizing control of the government, but by working hard, doing their jobs well, and engaging in acts of compassion that attracted the notice of outsiders in a crumbling society. Let me show you a quote from about 150 AD, from a document known as the Epistle of Matthews, written by an observer of the day about the Christians. This person wrote this: "Inhabiting Greek as well as barbarian cities, and following the customs of the natives in respect to clothing, food, and the rest of their ordinary conduct, they display to us their wonderful and confessedly striking method of life." In other words, what made the early Christians so influential in their world was their commitment to doing the simple work of everyday life. Being followers of Jesus did not lead them to abandon their careers. It made them better farmers, merchants, and carpenters. So, as Christians, we live in a world that Christ is transforming and renewing, and that includes our work. We can find fulfillment in our daily work as a way to partner with Christ in extending God's kingdom in the world. Now, that would be a nice way to conclude this talk. Of course, we have more time to get through, but unfortunately, it's more complicated than that. Now, before I became a provost, I was a professor of American history. And as a historian, I cannot ignore a group that often undermines my simple conclusions about life: the American slaves. Now, research would indicate that the African American slaves of the 1800s were probably one of the most Christianized populations in American history. But it's also difficult to think of a particular group that was the most miserable and unfulfilled in the work that they were doing. It's hard to imagine a more miserable way to spend your life than waking up at daybreak in the sweltering summer heat, working in the fields until sundown, then doing it all over again the next day. The example of the slaves serves as a vivid reminder that just because we have accepted Christ and are God's children doesn't mean that our work will be either enjoyable or fulfilling. It certainly wasn't that way for the slaves who loved Jesus just as much as we do, or perhaps more. So before I get to practical applications, let me summarize with two simple truths about work, quote, between the times of the fall and God's ultimate redemption of creation. First, even with work that we love, there are unpleasant parts to it. Now, I happen to be an avid road biker, not a good thing to be in Michigan in February. I ride about 4,000 miles a year. I'm falling a little behind, so hopefully if the weather warms up, I can catch up. So I would say that I love biking, but that doesn't mean that I always like being on my bike, especially here in Michigan. Picture being on a bike with 4 layers of clothing in one of those mid-March days when it's 40 degrees outside and raining. Now, I still go biking on those days, but I don't particularly enjoy doing it. It's just part of the discipline of road biking in general, and it keeps me in shape for those days when riding a bike truly is a joy. Now, it's the same with work. Even a fulfilling job has those aspects to it that are just plain drudgery and have to be gotten through with discipline. Now, you may love teaching, but you still have to grade 40 freshman comp essays on a Sunday night. As a faculty colleague of mine at Cornerstone once said, "I teach for free, they pay me to grade." A lot of faculty can identify with that. Moreover, there are Christians who spend their entire lives working the assembly line at the Ford Motor Plant without dreaming or expecting fulfilling work. Sometimes we Americans just expect too much of life. Now, fortunately, there's an opposite truth. Because we are wired by God to work, we can find some level of satisfaction even in the dreariest work. Another work story of my own. Back in college, my summer job consisted of removing asbestos from school buildings in the Chicago suburbs. This was after I was no longer stuffing newspaper inserts under the back porch. It was miserable work that required us to completely seal off the work areas with plastic sheeting, which made it about 100 degrees inside these buildings in July. And then we'd wear Tyvek suits and full face masks in order to go in and tear down the asbestos. The work was so bad that they paid us $15.35 an hour plus overtime. I can still remember that exact amount. It was great, which was pretty good money in the 1980s for a college student. But even though this was lousy work, my friends and I still took some satisfaction in doing this job as well as possible. When hanging up the plastic sheeting with duct tape, we would compete to see who could make the plastic walls as neat and level as possible. Now, our boss, who was a grizzled, earthy foreman from northwest Indiana, would often yell at us and tell us we were just removing asbestos, we're not building the Taj Mahal. And he would throw in a few additional colorful remarks that I won't quote right now. But as Christians who like making things, we couldn't help but find some satisfaction in hanging plastic sheets, even though it was just to remove asbestos from a school basement. So work is never quite as good as it could be, but neither is it quite as bad as it could be. That's what it means to live as Christians in a good but fallen world. So let me close this talk with some practical applications about work from someone who hopefully has made some progress in this area since stuffing newspaper inserts under the back porch. First of all, assuming that part of college at least is to prepare one for fulfilling work, how do we go about doing that? I would suggest two things in finding fulfilling work in life. The first is this: God has wired each of us to flourish in certain types of activities. And the sooner we discover our unique wiring, the more we can thrive in our work. Now, to me, if there's a job in the world that may be worse than removing asbestos, it would be being a junior high youth pastor. When I was in college, I couldn't understand how anyone could enjoy hanging out with 7th and 8th graders. Actually, I still can't. My college roommate at Moody, however, lit up in a room full of junior hires. Somehow he had a natural ability to connect with those kids, and unlike me, he loved doing it. Now, eventually, I did discover, however, that I could go to a library carrel for 10 hours a day, read books, and write a 300-page history dissertation, and that I actually, in a strange way, enjoyed doing that. That's something that my youth pastor friend would never be able to understand. Now, penguins are amusing creatures to us because they seem to live double lives. When you see them in those National Geographic documentaries waddling around the Antarctic, they're clumsy and comical. But the moment they dive into the ocean, they dart around with incredible speed and grace. Now, hopefully during your college years, if you're a student here, you discover those oceans in your own life where you go from waddling around in the snow to speeding through the water. That's a good clue as to your future work in life. Recently, I spent a few days in China with a consultant of ours at Cornerstone who's helping us do some recruiting there. Everyone wants to recruit in China right now, of course. This gentleman seemed a bit awkward here in the United States, and I had wondered whether it was a good idea to be hiring this person as a consultant. Then I met him in Beijing, and I was able to see this penguin effect. In that environment, he was comfortable, confident, and completely in control. 30 years ago, he had discovered that he was wired to love Chinese culture and to thrive there, and he's been doing that ever since. So the first key to thriving in a career is to find your particular ocean, that place where your talents and your enjoyment flow together to enable you to perform with speed and grace. Now, for Christians, there's a second consideration here. We find fulfillment in our work not only when we are in our place of giftedness, but when that work advances God's kingdom here on earth. So I'm going to show you a slide that you probably saw in my book. If you read it, I can plagiarize from myself, it's okay. Because we live in the time between Christ's first coming and his second coming, every aspect of culture is a potential arena where God's kingdom is either expanded or diminished. As Christians, then, we are called to engage in careers that push God's creation toward the way things are supposed to be. After all, it's possible to do your job well, but for that job itself to be working against the grain of God's work in the world. Or to put it in another way, we need to consider both the immediate effects of our work and the broader effects. So let's say that you discover that your particular ocean is in the area of marketing, and you make a career in advertising. That's what you're gifted in doing. You can make high-quality advertisements, the immediate product, but what about the broader effects of those advertisements in the kingdom? So let me take an extreme example here. You could use your gifts as an advertiser to make advertisements for Philip Morris Tobacco Company. In other words, advertisements that contribute to disease, poverty, and perhaps shortened lifespans, although they have medical studies probably contesting that. The Marlboro Man was a great marketing campaign, but it led to a lot of dead smokers. On the other hand, you could create quality ads for a nonprofit company that provides clean water to villages in Africa. In other words, to help move the needle of creation towards God's kingdom. Now, of course, these are extreme examples. I thought of using, example of an advertisement to adopt orphan puppies or something like that, but I thought that was even way over the top. But this is an oversimplification. In the real life, choices aren't that simple. So if you're a chemist, how do you tell whether the products that your experiments are helping to produce are doing good in the world or detracting from it? If you're a computer software programmer, is the software you're developing being used in beneficial ways or to create graphics for Grand Theft Auto version 5? In finding our places to flourish in our careers, it's important to think of the ripple effects of our work. We may see only the first stage, but God calls us to consider the whole chain. Now, all of this is summarized well in a quote that you may have seen before from the writer Frederick Buechner. He gets quoted in this line all the time, but I think it's an important one. The place God calls you is where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. We find the most fulfillment in our work when we operate in our area of giftedness and when the use of our talents meets a deep need in the world. Now, of course, I haven't said a thing yet about money. After all, beyond the lofty rhetoric of redemption, the main purpose of work is to make a living. So let me go out on a biblical limb here and suggest the following. If you truly follow your calling in life and flourish in the work that God has gifted you to do, sufficient financial resources will flow to that work. Now, I say that based on both my own experience and also on Matthew chapter 6. In this section of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is telling his followers, Jesus is telling his followers not to worry about food, clothing, and shelter. And as he says, seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all of these things will be added to you. Now, I truly believe, and as I said, this has been confirmed in my own life, when we devote our lives and talents to furthering God's kingdom in the unique way that he has gifted us, God honors that and provides us with a way to make a living. Now, there are, however, two important qualifiers in what I'm saying. First of all, Jesus promises us provision, not wealth. In the passage here, he uses the examples of birds and flowers to illustrate his point. And birds do have enough to eat, but they don't always have a year's supply of food, and they don't always eat 5-course French dinners. God promises to provide for our needs when we devote our careers to him, but he doesn't necessarily promise us wealth. Second, claiming God's promise of provision doesn't mean that we still don't have to make wise and perhaps pragmatic choices in the use of our talents. So you may be a wonderful musician who dreams of making your living playing the violin on summer evenings outside a sidewalk cafe in Paris. But to support a family, you may have to get a job teaching violin at the local high school and save Paris for your summer vacation. Now, I love to write, but I know better than to quit my day job as a provost and move to a cabin in the UP and write novels. And those of you who have read Why College Matters would probably agree with me. There's a difference between a vocation, that is something that we do for a living and find satisfaction in, and an avocation, something I do for the pure joy of it. Sometimes we need to keep that distinction in mind in choosing a career. Now, finally, since this is a university setting, I would like to offer some practical remarks for us in our particular roles as students, faculty, and staff. So here are a couple of words of advice, I guess, for students. The first is this, which you can barely see. All work is learning. Because God is the creator of everything, all work somehow contributes to our learning. It's all connected. So back in the 1990s, I was working on a PhD in history at the University of Notre Dame. Now, rather than follow the conventional path of waiting to start a family until after finishing graduate school, my wife and I had 3 children before I was done with my degree. So during the summers, my college friend and I would team together to run a residential painting business. I had the ladders and brushes, and he had a rusted-out old Toyota pickup truck. Now, at the time, I thought I was just making money over the summer to help support our family. What I've learned in retrospect, however, is that my work was also teaching me skills for life just as much as my doctoral courses were. I learned how to plan and budget for the future, how to allocate scarce resources, how to work with customers, and how to get along with a colleague who sometimes saw things differently from me. In other words, I was learning the skills that I use today as a university provost. Now, I may be overstating this a bit, but it might be that your job in the university dining commons teaches you as much as your class in psychology. So what this means is that your work now is worth your full effort and devotion. Self-discipline and hard work are not qualities that we turn on and off at will. They are virtues that we develop over time. So it's so similar actually to the discipline of tithing. Giving part of your income to God's work isn't something that you put off until you have enough money, because most of us never get to a point where we feel like we have enough money. It's a discipline that we learn even when we don't have much to give. When you're just out of college, you have student loans to pay off. Later, you get married and start a family, and you discover that kids are expensive little commodities. Then you have to buy a car, then save for college for those kids, and then save for retirement. If you don't learn the discipline of tithing when you have little, you're not likely to do it when you have more. I would suggest that it's the same with work. How you study for that Tuesday morning calculus test is a good indicator of how much effort you'll put into a budget report for your boss 10 years from now. Devotion to work isn't something you turn off now and somehow turn on later. It's a discipline that is learned in the little things and then applied to the bigger things. How you work now is pretty much how you'll work in the future. And that leads to a second application for students. Even when your work isn't fulfilling or you don't feel like it's advancing the kingdom in some meaningful way, your work is an act of worship to God. As Paul says in Colossians, "In whatever you do, work heartily, as for the Lord, not for men." If you're on the campus snow crew, make the snow banks along the sidewalk as straight as possible. If you have a 4-page essay to write, make it 4.5 pages, and don't expand the margins to 1.25 inches. We all know that trick. It doesn't work on professors. I love visiting the great Gothic cathedrals of Europe. One of the amazing things about them is that even in out-of-the-way places where no one would ever notice them, such as these gargoyles on the roof, the medieval stone carvers worked with extreme care and attention to detail. Why would they devote so much time to creating gargoyles that no one would ever see? Because it was said they carved for the eye of God. Now, as for faculty and staff who are already engaged in their life's work, I would also suggest a couple of applications. And the first one is this. Universities are complex institutions that can seem to drown out any creativity and meaning in work. We call this the Dilbert effect. In these environments, we thrive best when we are able to connect our particular work with the greater cause of the institution. So let me give another well-known cathedral story to illustrate my point here. A medieval traveler came upon a village full of workers engaged in a project. He asked a bricklayer what he was doing. The bricklayer replied, "I'm making a wall." Then he asked a glassblower what he was doing, and the glassblower replied, "I'm making stained glass windows." Then he asked a carpenter what he was doing, and the carpenter replied, "I'm building a great cathedral." Whatever your task at Spring Arbor, whether it's delivering mail, cleaning carpets, or teaching biology, you're playing a part in preparing the Christian leaders of tomorrow. That's enough to give meaning and purpose to any particular work at the university. Here's my second application. As co-workers in a Christian university, we are called to help empower each other in doing the work of the kingdom. Now, earlier I referred to Andy Crouch's distinction between the language of make it so and the language of let there be, which leaves room for creativity and expressions of new forms of power. Universities should be let there be institutions in which our own work doesn't dominate others but empowers them to exercise creative work in their own right. Now, that's especially true for institutions, leaders in the institutions. As a university provost, I have slowly learned to resist my first instinct to take on new projects. Instead, the university flourishes more when I find others whose passion and gifts equip them to accomplish the task in different ways than I would, and often with better results. In other words, work in a Christian university setting means collaboration, not domination. Now, finally, there is an important principle for all of us when it comes to work. My last lesson. Work is only fulfilling and productive if there are also times of not working. The biblical notion of a Sabbath rest goes against our contemporary culture's obsession with productivity and success. And it's a crucial discipline for us as Christians if we are to resist those idols. Taking one day a week to rest and intentionally choosing to leave things undone is to renounce power, to acknowledge that I am a finite being who depends on others and ultimately on God to be successful in my work. Now, years ago, I adopted a practice as provost of shutting down the computer and iPhone every Saturday night, sometimes it's very late on Saturday night, and devoting Sunday to anything but my regular work as a provost. It can be a difficult discipline to maintain since there's always another email that can be answered or a report to be written. But I've learned that it's essential to my own spiritual health to do that. Otherwise, I can fall victim to the prideful delusion that it's my own efforts, not God's blessing, that brings success to my work. So I would encourage you, even as a student, to find a way to develop the intentional discipline of rest as an expression of your dependence on God. Now, if you have a final exam on Monday morning, I would not suggest you use Sunday as your day of rest. But there are ways to plan your life and your week in order to find those pockets of rest on a regular basis in your work week. Our work is to be an expression of worship to God, not an assertion of our own omnipotence. Cultivating the habit of rest is a way to continuously embed that thought in our own souls. Let me close this talk with another little story. This is not my own, but from a writer that you know of, J.R.R. Tolkien, and I think it illustrates a lot of what I'm trying to communicate here. When he wasn't writing the Lord of the Rings trilogy that would become one of the major literary works of the 20th century, J.R.R. Tolkien wrote a short story called Leaf by Niggle. In Tolkien's story, Niggle is a painter who gets a vision of painting a masterpiece of a vast landscape. He lays out a canvas in his studio so large that he needs a ladder in order to work on it. Then he sets out to paint. But his progress is painfully slow because he is distracted in his work by all sorts of mundane chores. In particular, his neighbor is always needing his help, so Niggle has to stop working on his painting in order to go help his neighbor. Moreover, Niggle is too much of a perfectionist to get very far in his painting. As Tolkien writes, he was the sort of painter who can paint leaves better than trees. He used to spend a long time on a single leaf. Now, eventually, Niggle dies with his painting incomplete. After his death, the people who buy his house find his crumbling canvas, upon which one beautiful leaf has remained intact. The leaf is put in the town museum, and as Tolkien writes, for a long while, Leaf by Niggle hung there in a recess and was noticed by a few eyes. The story then follows Niggle on his journey beyond death. When Niggle arrives at the outskirts of the far country, something catches his eye. Tolkien writes, before him stood the tree, his tree, finished, its leaves opening, its branches growing and bending in the wind that Niggle had so often felt or guessed, and yet had so often failed to catch. Niggle's leaf has grown into the tree that is part of the landscape of the heavenly country. Now, by now, you probably have a vision of something you want to accomplish in life, something that will impact the world and that you will be remembered for. Whatever that task is, I can assure you, you will be frustrated and sometimes discouraged by the contrast between all you hope to accomplish and what actually gets done. Perhaps only a single leaf will remain on the crumbling canvas of your life's work. But if that work is what God has called you to do, in some way it will bear fruit. God created us to work, and while it may not always be enjoyable or fulfilling work, through it we can find satisfaction and contribute in some small way to the building of God's kingdom. Our particular leaves will grow into the trees that populate the heavenly country. Our work is worship, and our work matters for the kingdom. Let me close this in prayer. Let's pray. Father, I thank you for the gift of work. I pray that you would give us wisdom to choose our work wisely, strength to do our work well, and patience to persevere through the difficulties of work. And I pray that through our work, we would glorify you. I pray these things in your Son's name. Amen. Thank you for your time.